Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Midway. In the last year or so, I've been able to add more cornerstones to the series about 20th century warfare, especially World War I, World War II. There's an entire series on the Vietnam War, and we're expanding also in other wars, other theaters. We will continue this also shortly. The purpose is creating some sort of core some basis for Schwerpunkt being able to attract further audience that can thus be sucked into the broader polymological spectrum of the channel. I think this is very important because, of course, for years we made mostly ancient, medieval, and essentially Renaissance warfare. The channel is staying unavoidably tuned on those. I can't really think, even if I continue this for my entire life, of a moment which we will abandon those eras. If anything, we have to cover everything as a big encyclopedia of warfare and more. Videos like these are titled, like in this case, Battle of Midway, an overview, because we will surely add much more on this at some other point. We'll make more and better analysis of the same battle, campaign, etc. But again, it's fundamental for a military history channel to at least start with this big titles. And as you'll see, well, we'll surely at least cover the Battle of Midway as any other topic more in depth than the average YouTube video. At the same time, we really want to keep it simple, even by Schwerpunkt standards, to explain a battle in this case that is a bit complex in its tactical development, and that just by heart is not too easy to get right if you're not presented with a whole picture. But it's also simpler than it seems. Let's simply get to that. And the context, of course, is important. That's why we make an overview. You know what we're talking about. Most of my audience is American. After the audacious assault on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto of Japan, a Harvard-educated strategist who had served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington and masterminded the Pearl Harbor attack, pursued a definitive battle to obliterate the remaining U.S. naval forces. Naturally, we will not digress too much on the even broader context to this all. What kind of goals could Japan realistically attain in the context of the broader global war, and so on. In any case, Yamamoto's ambition, as also not just as a military thinker, was to subdue the formidable American power, which ended up, as we know, in hindsight, of course, in a culmination of disaster that determined eventually the destiny of the same land of the rising sun during World War II. The Battle of Midway was such a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. Many people say, oh, well, but this is the turning point, just like Stalingrad on the Eastern Front or El Alamein in North Africa. We'll make videos about this too as well. But as you know, not just out of Clausewitzian culture, but just like sort of basic military logic, there is not such a thing like a real turning point unless you want to craft this within a broader narrative and saying, yes, this was objectively sort of the most important, momentous event in the Pacific War, and it had sort of broader ramifications. There are some things that after this will never be the same. Of course, Japan got the worst of that and all that stuff, but it's incorrect to simply basically say things, I don't know, because of Midway, now Japan was doomed to lose, right? It's not there is no determinism in warfare. If anything, you can look at politics, you can look at what was happening also in the rest of the world, especially in this time, for things to go really in different directions depending on sort of what point we want to look at. And at some level, it's even unpredictable. Again, not to minimize absolutely the importance of these battles, but for showing you how even these points are part of a much bigger set of factors that are happening all the time, even though that wouldn't culminate in a single climatic battle. It seems as if, from this point onward, like the greatest difficulty was surpassed or something like that. is just not in line with the concept of warfare, and especially with the notion of decisivity. As von Clausewitz explains, the only decisive battle in a war is the last battle of the war. And not because, again, things weren't going worse, but because, again, you must understand the instrumental relation between politics and war, right? You could have gone on further for obtaining something at a political level, even after that battle, or even stopping at the first one for some other reason. There's no doubt that in the so-called jump of the frog jump strategy, let's say, highlighting the strategic and logistical challenges of the Pacific, namely, in fact, that it's a war fought in an ocean with very scarce land, and therefore with very scarce points of appui, so to say. Midway, especially for the Americans, represented such an extraordinary victory that facilitated the rest of the war, but was also the proof of American superiority at sea, at least in this cooperation of mostly aerial and naval warfare, in ways that really exposed the greater advancements of the United States over fascist Japan, that at some point we'll talk about, because among the many myths that have been crafted for, at least you can understand, politically righteous, but politically functional, at least, reasons after World War II by the same Americans, Japan was not the great, honorable, competent, incredibly powerful enemy that, it's been somehow described. Like, there is a strange way to describe the Axis in all its components. We'll talk about other campaigns, wars. Some great defeats of the Axis have not been properly pointed out in all their might, so to say. Some victories instead have been minimized. On the other hand, and generally speaking, I think that people do not understand much about World War II in general, nor that we have created after the war any sort of broader international, but also national, political, cultural environment where people know literally anything about the war in a broader historical sense, and of course also in a properly strategical one. But you really need to know the history of all these countries, all the world, in perspective, in order to understand the war itself, and also what happened later accordingly, which I think the average adult in the world has literally and absolutely not the palest idea of to begin with. But this is another topic. There is no doubt that the Battle of Midway exposed Japan's overconfidence and strategic miscalculations, shifting the naval balance towards the Allies. So definitely, yes, at this point, the Americans have the upper hand in the Pacific, and they start showing it. The loss of Japan's carrier-based air power not only crippled its offensive capabilities, but also marked the first significant check on its imperial ambitions. This was really the war that opened to carrier-based air power that would remain one of the greatest indicators of global strategic projectional capacity. Yamamoto, who had risen through the ranks after graduating from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1904. Remember, these are the same years close to, Tsushima, to all a specific Japanese expansion and projectional vision as the rise of essentially the hegemonic power in the Far East, and really coming into being true naval power in great part. Wasn't it only for the fact that Japan is an archipelago in and of itself? He himself survived the injuries at the Battle of Tsushima. And we have to imagine, even in the history of the person, how this affected his belief in the following decades and up to Midway, that a decisive victory, as we defined it before, would force the US to negotiate, essentially making it too costly for the Americans to simply bridge the Pacific to bring war into Japan itself, had in fact the American naval forces been crippled enough in the process. This naturally underestimated the US resilience, the fact that this was a young, bold, aggressive, ambitious nation that was in this moment of crisis and affront, of course, able to surpass its self-sabotaging isolationism, and that would bring it, in fact, to be the greatest power in the world ever since. Only Emperor Hirohito and a handful of senior Japanese officers were privy to the full scope of the crushing defeat endured from July the 4th to the 7th, 1942, that we're describing today, in the waters surrounding the isolated Midway atoll. Fascist propaganda control was quite tight on Japan in incredibly brutal ways. By the way, Yamamoto was in charge of the entire fleet, and so his was his broader military responsibility. Then the Japanese government had to cope with a broader issue and its consequences. The calamity at Midway was so severe for the Japanese that the surviving personnel from the engaged units were dispersed to guard far-flung Pacific islands, barred from communicating with their families or fellow Japanese servicemen, a bit like the Roman survivors at Canna, including quite importantly competent military men, were kept away from the fatherland and prevented from revealing the scale of the defeat to their connationals. This isolation was a calculated move to obviously suppress the spread of demoralizing news, as the destruction of 4 fleet carriers, representing the backbone of Japan's naval aviation, dealt a blow from which the Navy could not recover. The decision to scatter survivors was driven by the fear that the accounts could undermine the morale of other units, given the cultural emphasis on honor and invincibility in Japan's military ethos, which viewed a defeat as a profound shame. So obviously, there is a given time and especially a certain amount of resources that now are being jeopardized exactly by the spread of the American forces in the Pacific, and which that are not going to be enough, in fact, for Japan to reconstitute that force in time, unless something happened, of course, in Europe and other fronts that could, again, politically salvage the Japanese position. In any case, this is, as far as the Japanese forces can rely by themselves, a complete disaster. For days, even the Japanese army's top brass remained uninformed about the catastrophe. So the Japanese armed forces as a whole, that should have been, in this sense, cooperate in a competent fashion, were rigged by this internal propaganda and informational block and repression, while the Japanese populace was fed a narrative of another thrilling triumph over the Americans. So blatant lie, a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign to sustain public support for the war effort, leveraging state-controlled media to project an image of unbroken success through carefully curated radio broadcasts that had been a bit like in these totalitarian regimes, actually quite advanced, quite some sort of pride in even advancing the technology, the fields themselves, but used in fact for these, at the end of the day, incompetent purposes. The same was for newspaper reports. The idea of a success over the Americans was basically the only thing that most people in Japan learned of after Midway. Had the reality been disclosed, it's likely the Japanese people and military would have struggled to accept it. Even both were steadfastly convinced of their fated victory, embodied in the slogan Sekai Dai Iki, that is first in the world. Naturally, Japanese culture is quite peculiar. Like, it's the only country I can think of that had a revolution from the top down, and that therefore had nourished some, at some point, also valid trust and confidence in the capacity of the establishment, etc. But again, the history of fascist Japan is a bit of another story, and surely the country was paying for it in the broader, level of backwardness that, after all, Japan had just recently emerged from culturally. So you can understand how this blind faith / confidence in the government was mirrored by probably the incapacity of the same Japanese people and its structures to understand what was going on. Not that they would have likely made a revolution or something, but that simply they would have not even probably gotten it had they learned it in some, as surely someone did, like in transverse ways. And Japanese imperialism, aggressiveness and arrogance in the scene is, of course, there. Again, this people was incredibly pervaded by a sense of racial superiority, of broader national ideologism. They had been exterminating, of course, tens of millions of Chinese from quite a while by now on the basis of that. And again, they were not particularly tender for respecting sort of particular international conventions or whatever. Again, judge it however you want it, but as you know, this was one of the most ferocious regimes as well in the history of mankind. And these were the decades where there were plenty of from multiple sides. And this concept of being the first in the world was, let's not forget it, very much loaded in hatred, right, towards the West as well, right? They had been imitating the West in the process of modernization, but at the same time, they felt that that part of the world was theirs. And of course, their sort of genetic background did not quite align with the with the racialistic, suprematistic ideas of, for example, National Socialism, regardless of the Axis alliance, but not even from their side, but some kind of, at least Pacific and Far East Asia shared with a European order as well. And so this deep conviction of global supremacy, prevalent, again, in other nations at the time, was, however, so deeply rooted in Japan, in the myth of the emperor's divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, that it informed really every aspect of Japanese society and culture. The belief in military dominance was bolstered by the historic impregnability of Japan's islands, right? We talked about this, of course, as channeled mostly based on medieval warfare. There was an idea probably of divine support from the sea, from the wind, right? So the idea that any naval threat, just like the oceanic Mongol one, would have been thwarted because of the racial, spiritual virtue of the Japanese people. The same seemed promising, as I was saying before, also in Yamamoto's own experience in the tradition of the modernized Japanese Navy, because of a series of victories, starting with the defeat of Tsarist Russia in 1905, extending through the 100 days after Pearl Harbor. That also was a hell of a blow. We will see in other videos at some point, during which Japanese forces repeatedly overwhelmed the lethargic Allied armies. And you know that the Axis, say, in the first years of the war was sort of more proactive in many ways, and that in order to wake up again the sleeping giant that the same Yamamoto found out, to have accomplished would take a while, but eventually would be a pretty tough issue to cope with. Besides, I'm preparing a video about the British raid on Taranto, which, as you know, inspired the same Japanese for their own attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, many of them went over to Italy to study exactly the bombing, say how it had happened, etc. Given that also, of course, the British were not revealing their secrets, say their lessons learned to any other Axis power. We'll see how definitely in doctrine, in technology, and in broader strategical fashion, like all these victories had been competently scored by the Japanese Navy. These triumphs, including the rapid conquests of Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines, reinforced a sense of invulnerability. Here, like the Allied presence had been cleared, fostering a dangerous overconfidence that blinded Japan to its vulnerabilities. The Japanese military's reliance on the doctrine of the Kogeki Seishin, that is to say, the offensive spirit, right, which prioritized aggressive action over defensive preparedness, which was it is actually an important strategic principle, and von Clausewitz is clear about, of course, the positive aim of the attacker, regardless of the stronger form of war that the defense constitutes, as leaving the initiative to the enemy is, however, really destructive and self-destructive in that sense, further exacerbated this Japanese hubris, leaving little room for contingency planning as well. In other words, yes, you would have won, but then what if things started going wrong, and or what if you had overconfidently predicted even the premises for a war like the one in the Pacific? Well, Midway, but in part even certain aspects of Pearl Harbor, were lessons learned. In every action, in every operation, you fail at something, right? And that's something you have to fix later. But here there were sort of broader issues that Midway in particular revealed at a broader scale. In warfare, such unexamined assumptions of superiority can swiftly lead to carelessness, because if you are not, let's say, exposed to pressure, to failure, like you can hardly sort of roll up your sleeves, like properly from a moral point of view, to stiffen those weaker parts. Otherwise, we'll simply go on just like that and crack exactly at the worst moment when maybe you will have developed greater capacities in all this, but not the ones, again, to adequately sustain them through other parts of your your military, basically. Japan's failure to anticipate, for example, the American cryptographic advances would demonstrate this overconfidence. This was a critical oversight that allowed the U.S. to prepare an effective counter-strategy exploiting Japan's overextension. As well, of course, America was much more, if anything, technologically, but more, again, civilizationally and strategically advanced country. American morale was admittedly at its nadir after Pearl Harbor. On December the 8th, 1941, the day following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, by the way, with a deep interest in naval strategy, declared unequivocally, quote, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." Right? I want to make some videos about Mayhem, the Manifest Destiny, etc., also to understand better sort of certain aspects of American politics, culture, and spirit, so to say. U.S. forces were summoned to respond with urgency and resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor left the United States consumed by indignation, but also gripped by a sense of powerlessness that hindered its ability to counter effectively. Because even in the moment, like what to do, right? Even just a broader war, as you could imagine, just the isolationistic problem is just all one with that, because the Japanese are not going to simply take over America with a mass invasion like they could have carried out to China. If you have Nazi Germany and her allies in Europe fighting against this broader contiguous landmass of the Soviet Union, you have like the obvious, escalation at sort of levels of, in fact, also of hate, of directly expandable popular hatred and taste for military gamble and sort of bigger strategic play, also for politics to reason it already much more directly escalatingly applicable level with a country that lives from the other side of the ocean. Really need some sort of broader vision or at least some way to convince your people of this straightforward capacity to attain that result, that in fact the U.S. will succeed to get in the end. The destruction of much of the Pacific Fleet's battleship force at Pearl Harbor was, of course, a huge deal. This was coupled with the loss of key bases in the Pacific, such as Wake Island and Guam, creating a strategic vacuum that demanded bold response, but also a quite delicate one, exactly because these single points scattered in the ocean needed to sustain, a force that was to be selectively vehiculated in the right Schwerpunkt, so to say, of the broader Japanese resistance. At this point, it's its beginning, it's the hardest moment, right? A dramatic action was essential to demonstrate to the American public, as well as Japan and the global community of both enemies and friends, that the dormant giant had been roused, restoring confidence in the nation's ability to strike back and signaling, especially to allies like Britain and China that were really taking, as you know, quite heavy blows, that the U.S. remained a formidable force in all the world, right, capable of projecting such power despite its early setbacks on a global scale to sustain their war effort, right? Among numerous proposals, the Select Plan was as daring as it was aspirational, promising at most a symbolic win, right? The famous first bombing raid on Japan, which was, however, an actual, masterpiece in its own regard, but also a striking genius move in terms of propaganda and vision, right? Because it really showed that how much the Japanese had been able to strike on American soil. It doesn't matter on the our way, etc., but in that, in fact, very sense of American unity, the Americans could bomb the same Japanese mainland the same way. And that was the bet because, as you know, in order to bring air power to Japan, you needed carriers. And at this point, the American naval power had been crippled from one side, but not quite in this aerial carrier capability. That was risked at the point of, however, succeeding to reach Japan and telling that we are coming. So on April the 18th, 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet, accompanied by Enterprise, which had miraculously, by the way, escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor, because as the Japanese had been searching exactly for those, understanding, of course, what the broader strategic deal was in terms of aerial strategic projection, and a modest flotilla was tasked with transporting a squadron of 16 bombers, B-25s, by motors. They are, fairly large, but they're also the smaller kind that could be, in fact, quite daringly taken off from a carrier runway, plus loaded with bombs. And led notoriously by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, that had essentially ideated the operation itself, close enough to strike Tokyo and other Japanese cities, but with sufficient fuel, at least hopefully, for a return journey that, as you know, I have some discrete interest in World War II aerial warfare, and we'll talk probably way more about this at some point. But you know that only one little, AA gun shrapnel can, make a hole in your fuel tanks and run out of fuel quite easily, even for a scratch, so to say. So it's definitely a Russian roulette of sort. Doolittle, a renowned aviator with a doctorate in aeronautics from the MIT and a decorated test pilot, which takes some guts, really, and therefore was perfectly apt to this task, had been chosen for his expertise in high-risk missions already. The mission required the aforementioned B-25s to launch 400 miles farther from Japan than planned. Why though? Due to the early detection of the task force by a Japanese picket boat, forcing an earlier than anticipated takeoff that further strained fuel reserves, to the point that even if everything had gone fine, in the moment, it was not really possible to calculate whether they could have been able to land, for example, as they did in some cases in China later on. None of the American aircraft were downed by Japanese anti-aircraft fire during the operation, regardless of course, damage inflicted. In a way, they tended to bomb at quite sort of low altitude to just, naturally with time bomb, etc., to even escape part of the imposing aerial defenses that existed or anti-aerial defenses existed over Japan. After inflicting minor damage and killing 50 civilians, the US planes crashed in either China or Siberia with depleted fuel tanks in some cases, exactly because they had exhausted them. Doolittle believed he would face a court-martial upon returning, fearing the mission's limited material impact would be deemed a failure by military authorities, given the loss of all 16 aircraft and the minimal physical destruction achieved. But he was wrong, because what he managed to pull off, even with this sort of conventionally scarce result, was in and of itself an enormous feat. The news of the raid was precisely what the United States of America needed, igniting widespread public fervor. They had really brought war into Japan. Promoted and honored, Doolittle became a celebrated figure, featured on posters urging workers to dedicate their force in his name. Famously enough, do it for Doolittle. And so he became a meme of resilience, bravery, boldness, exactly what the Americans needed at this point, and giving them that confidence to overcome such a faraway enemy that, however, deserved to be taken out. The Japanese countered with a wordplay. Doolittle, of course, for American propaganda. This seemingly minor operation really shifted the trajectory of the war in the Far East, just for saying before how moral forces are more important even than mere materiel. We could naturally digress on many other aspects, such as of the fact that the American society was just like the world at the time at large, particularly racistic, and of course the same Americans had, just like, I don't know, even a randomly out of the picture country like Sweden carrying out eugenics legislation that were very resemblant also to some fascist countries. But this was, again, absolutely the world at the time. Racial hatred was very important for military motivation across the world, as well as time, and even just on some national basis. Right, I mean, think how the Europeans were fixating on, of course, the various genetic backgrounds that pertained to them, even though they were, quite very closely related. Imagine, of course, for an American to unleash hell over some. Okay, I will not use racial slurs, but you understand what kind of point it was. It was really common at some point to take souvenirs from the battlefront, like skulls of killed enemies. I mean, things that were normal up to, again, for very few generations ago. Today we sort of find appalling to a degree, but that, again, was pretty much in tune with the spirit of our grandfathers, and for this very reason, even more important to understand. Now, within Japan's high command, a heated dispute emerged over the war's next steps as well. The army pushed for further expansion and consolidation of the wedge driven between the Americans and their Commonwealth allies, of course at sea and partly also on land through Southeastern Asian conquests. All right, we talked about this also in the video about the partition of India, and we'll talk about those sort of Japan-India clashes as well in the frontier. In fact, the entire point was possibly extending the war, bringing it to Australia, or threatening India itself, a strategy aimed at securing for Japan resource-rich territories like the oil fields, especially in the Dutch East Indies, because Japan was notoriously without many natural resources for modern warfare waging, right? And so actually needed to control this maritime possessions overseas to import through, in fact, their civilian ships, the necessary material for sustaining the war effort and the war machine, the Japanese war machine. The Navy, under the esteemed and authoritative Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, advocated for reclaiming momentum in the Pacific. At the same time, it was important in that moment to show that Japan could score yet another great victory, arguing that, also in more concrete terms, neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet was essential to securing Japan's perimeter that could sort of shield, in fact, the Japanese Empire from these infiltrations and interferences from, of course, now a fully provoked and declared enemy. The Doolittle Raid, by penetrating Japan's homeland defenses, exposed the vulnerability of the home islands, forcing a reevaluation of priorities and tipping the scales towards the Navy's Pacific-focused strategy as it highlighted the immediate threat to Japan's core. The 16 bombers, however, settled that debate. As we've seen, Japan's military had been shamed in front of the world, by the way, by failing in its paramount duty, safeguarding the emperor first and foremost. The Americans had courteously spared the Imperial Palace, an obvious target in central Tokyo that, by the way, had been also recently destroyed in large parts of the city by a fire in the past decade. And so now represented a sort of rebuilt system that the empire itself had enshrined to this higher level of imperial grandeur. But it was evident that Hirohito's safety had been at their discretion. And of course, the rest of the Japanese population was equally exposed and also not living so sumptuously as their own leader. This perceived dishonor, deeply felt in a culture where, as we've seen, the emperor was a divine figure. And so, as we've seen in tradition, right, what kind of emperor is defeated, is shamed, etc. Like, he must react. The imperial divine power must be immediately unleashed, instantiated in a great victory to wash this shame, which is already abnormal, right? And galvanizing the same military leadership to act decisively to restore national pride as well. The military in Japan was quite powerful, by the way. All the various Axis countries had sort of different balance in terms of sort of the ruling party, the sort of more historical institutions, the military, the industrials, etc. So that we will see at this point one day between Germany, Italy, Japan, etc. There was thus only one traditional path to redemption, which passed through further bloodshedding, to drive the Americans further eastward, ensuring the homeland's security by extending Japan's defensive perimeter. The raid's psychological impact thus directly influenced the decision to target Midway, as it underscored the need to eliminate the American threat in the Central Pacific, preventing further incursions into Japanese territory. Japan redirected its strategic focus accordingly from Southeast Asian expansion to an offensive in the Central Pacific, targeting the Midway Atoll, the farthest extension of American presence in the West. The choice of Midway was deeply strategic. Its capture would not only extend Japan's defensive perimeter, but also potentially lure the U.S. fleet into a trap, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation that could secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Despite being the most progressive, so to say, thinker among Japan's high command, and privately acknowledging that the United States was gravely underestimated, because there was, of course, so much you could say publicly as far as the regime was allowing you to begin with, Admiral Yamamoto, whose experience in the same U.S. gave him insight into its industrial capacity, concluded that the Americans were disheartened, disorganized, and teetering on collapse, dismissing President Roosevelt's words as mere bravado. Right. So from one side, he acknowledged that the United States were really that powerful and dangerous, but at the same time, he thought that in the moment, they were really weak and vulnerable. His team devised a strategy to catch the Americans by surprise, capturing Midway through an amphibious assault, because let's not forget that there was also some land action in Midway, thereby luring the remnants of the U.S. fleet into a vulnerable position to be decisively crushed in the Kantai-Kessen, that is to say, the decisive battle, which in Japanese sounds too oddly close to the German Kesselschlacht, as a matter of fact, which is a similar concept, doctrinally wise as well, which Yamamoto hoped would force, in fact, the Americans to eventually negotiate peace. The Japanese were convinced thus that the U.S., weakened by a perceived lack of resolve, would yield initiative to their fleet as well. So confident were they of victory that Japan's Imperial Postal Service was directed to begin forwarding mail to Midway for the occupying forces starting mid-June, right? So literally, before this is conquered already, since it takes so long to for mail to arrive there, let's send it in advance, as we will have to deal with, the administration there and the further war waging from the same Midway atoll. And this was the logistical detail, if you want, a cherry on top, reflecting the Japanese certainty of success, which for such huge operations is something you should be at least wary of. But again, you see how moral forces are important. They can make you believe that your adversary is somewhere that he's actually not. All right, you may be too galvanized, overconfident, whatever, and not realizing that lots of different things can come out of the blue, and that there are no rules really in war, right? Unlike with bullying, right, which is not Vietnam, just to make a very high citation. Now, while the postal system was highly efficient, Japanese intelligence was actually not. In fact, failing to suspect that American cryptographers, as we hinted at before, had actually already cracked enough of the Navy's code to discern the Japanese plans. The U.S. Navy's intelligence team, operating out of Station HYPO in Hawaii under Commander Chester W. Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet's commander-in-chief with a background in submarine warfare and strategic planning, deciphered critical elements of the Japanese, in fact, JN-25 code, identifying Midway as the target and providing precise details of the planned attack, including the timing and composition of the Japanese forces. This intelligent coup, achieved through exhaustive cryptanalysts and traffic analysis, enabled the U.S. to prepare a counter-ambush nullifying Japan's element of surprise. Figure this about the Allies, if anything. Again, it's mostly much politics, strategy, also industrial-based to a degree, but technology, all right? Deciphering codes, right? Secret codes. Think about Enigma. Think about here. The Allies really achieved much, and yet, in fact, you can argue that no difference was made when, for example, the Italian crypto codes were never deciphered by the Allies, but still didn't change much for them. Just to understand from one side how important also the technological edge is, but how it still floats over a pile of lots of other stuff, right? In this sense, the U.S. were really advanced, especially compared to Japan. Nimitz's strategic foresight, honed at the Naval War College, allowed him to position his limited forces effectively, leveraging intelligence to offset Japan's numerical advantage. And that was not all. Right? You had to fight the battle. Again, there is no such thing like we win the battle even before it's fought. All right, the bigger the engagement, especially historically, this is not the case. You can do much that will enable you to begin with to fight on sort of equal footing at this point, regardless of the blow. that the Americans in this case had suffered at Pearl Harbor, even probably in quantitative and qualitative fashion, because again, the U.S. Navy was also pretty good in many ways. That Midway itself will show, as we'll see now, but it is still yet all to be settled, right? You have just to arrive in the best possible condition, but then you must fight. This is something that the strategic analysis we tend to forget a bit. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the American fleet had already departed Pearl Harbor to confront them. Japan's Rengo Kantai, or combined fleet, was split into two operational units. One headed north to execute a diversionary maneuver, seizing outposts in the Aleutian Islands to threaten Alaska. If you Google, these are beautiful images of down zeros in a landscape that, in fact, you don't connect much to the Pacific War, that is quite tropical looking. This move intended to divert American attention and resources from the main objective. The primary force commanded by Yamamoto was assigned to attack Midway. This was a powerful force, the bulk, of course, of the Japanese one, and divided into three segments. So a basic sort of simple yet effective strategic repartition that, however, revealed within itself further complications. The first segment included battleships and warships poised for the expected decisive engagement with the American fleet, wielding the full might of their artillery, which indeed, especially like the American shortage in battleships, was much of a cornerstone of the Japanese firepower strategy. The second was the Kido Butai, the mobile attack group under Vice Admiral Choichi Nagumo. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. I don't remember in phonetics how to pronounce, whether hard or soft in any case. Comprising 2/3 of the aircraft carriers. The third consisted of amphibious landing forces intended for the Midway assault. Nagumo, a seasoned officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack but lacked deep experience in carrier operations, relied heavily on his subordinates' expertise. The Kido Butai was akin to a boxer with a devastating punch but weak defenses. Its carriers were inadequately protected, with few aircraft allocated to their defense, and escort ships were positioned in a broad reconnaissance perimeter rather than closely guarding the carriers. The decision to deploy escorts in a wide ring was based on the assumption that early detection of enemy forces would allow ample time for response, but this left the carriers exposed to rapid, concentrated attacks, a flow compounded by Japan's underestimation of American carrier mobility. Right. This, by the way, was the main problem in this all, that there is not a deep integration of this different type of forces, battleships, air carriers, and even just their the internal predisposition. They were standing relatively on their own and essentially lacking some deeper integrated coordination, right, between each other. Nevertheless, no one at Imperial headquarters questioned the assumption that carrier-based aircraft would have ample time to bomb Midway, demolish its defenses in one strike, return, and rearm before American carriers could even depart Pearl Harbor and reach an effective offensive range, because they literally had no clue about that. Of course, had they known, probably they would have taken measures, right? But they blipped up at such a bigger level in not realizing that the Americans knew everything and they were already there. All right. Some concerns were voiced but were brushed aside, because there is always some sort of genius or non-genius that sort of points out also the obvious in in as much in warfare, nothing is certain. So there is always a possibility that something will actually go, even in the most unpredictable way. You just have to be able to assess the probability, bet, and roll the dice. As trivial, reflecting a broader cultural aversion to challenging established plans within the Japanese military hierarchy. Right, this is a problem, like excessive confidence in an established hierarchy without any sort of questioning of something that is inherently possible to stem also from a lower understanding. In fact, dissent at that point was often equated with disloyalty and just a general sense of betrayal towards Japanese unity and government and policy. A planned seaplane reconnaissance over Pearl Harbor, which could have verified the presence or absence of the U.S. fleet, was aborted when the submarine tasked with refueling the planes found the rendezvous point occupied by American forces. This is quite interesting. Of course, there are seaplanes that can land on water and be resupplied by submarines, and this is of course quite interesting. And you have the full might of the American Navy just on the same way. This operation was codenamed Operation K, relying on long-range Kawanishi H-8K flying boats, but the presence of U.S. ships at French frigate shoals disrupted the refueling plan, forcing its cancellation. Yet no one saw fit to alert Yamamoto to this troubling development. So the fear within the military hierarchy was so big that the same information gathering was actually hampered in the process. You understand how sort of sclerotically rigged the Japanese military actually was at this point. Similarly, Yamamoto overlooked the unusually high volume of, in fact, urgent messages that still emanated at this point from Pearl Harbor, which were obviously indicative, if anything, of the fact of a heightened American activity and suggested the possibility that their fleet was already at sea. Naturally, when you embark yourself in such an enormous enterprise and you're starting to discover that things are maybe, of course, really rigged by some major unforeseen factor, which is actually the biggest one you can have in this moment, and the information is not certain just per se, or at least you don't have a clear information on the amount of the enemy force in the moment, who they can be, etc. There is all a psychological struggle revolving around, like, do I go on or not? Like, especially in the moment where I can't see. And that's actually also the most pressuring. But still, right, in order to, there are different ways psychologically to get to the point of accepting the risk. But some of these pass through underestimation, the underestimation of the same, right? Some kind of fatalistic attitude that is incoherent, incongruent with the actual function of command. The failure to act on these signals was a critical oversight rooted again in the Japanese command's assumption that the U.S. fleet remained incapacitated post-Pearl Harbor, a misjudgment that ignored Nimitz's aggressive redeployment of assets that would have been sort of documentable in many other ways. In fact, the American fleet had in reality already set sail and was, so to say, and well aware of the Japanese forces' dispersal as well. Right? The U.S. Navy would disregard the Aleutian diversion and concentrate on ambushing the Kido Butai, which also spoke of great clarity. Like if there is a main theater. A secondary one is open just even for diversion. You deal with different things at a time, knowing that, of course, like it's not like the entire Japanese Navy was in Alaska, right? So there was a pretty straightforward understanding that not just they knew, the Americans, as you see, knew in advance where most of the Japanese forces were, but they also knew in the sense that the secondary front was sort of irrelevant in the bigger picture, and the greatest amount of expendable assets were to be invested in the Central Pacific. Nagumo proceeded with the plan as directed, by the way, despite the clear failure of the surprise attack on Midway. American defenses appeared vigilant and prepared to respond, bolstered by radar installations and reinforced air patrols that had been alerted due to the impending attack through intercepted intelligence. The U.S. garrison on Midway, equipped with additional aircraft, including obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, and anti-aircraft defenses. Midway is fairly small, right? Again, it's mostly just a point de vue. It cannot host enormous military forces. But again, it was relatively well protected. And in fact, far more formidable than the Japanese had anticipated, further complicating Nagumo's mission because, again, there were some troops to be landed there. And so even just the land fight was a matter of, again, maybe the first waves fail, you don't have enough manpower to land again, you can shell the blip out of the entire Midway, but if you still have some Americans entrenched in there, what do you do, right? It complicates the entire range of operations, it makes you lose a lot of precious time. These are all things that matter, and you understand how different levels of operation interfere with one another. The island's defenders, under the commander of Marine Colonel Harold D. Shannon, a veteran of World War I with experience in defensive fortifications, and that's trench warfare, quite a lesson you will learn, had in fact fortified Midway's defenses in anticipation of an attack. And again, naval artillery shelling is no joke. All right, it's intense, and especially on such a small target, it's something terrifying. But still, right, you cannot simply dislodge infantry forces as a whole without, some intense fighting on the same land, ensuring at least the atoll could withstand the initial Japanese assault. At approximately 7:15 a.m. on June the 4th. The Kita-Butai's bombers returned from their Midway raid, reporting unexpectedly fierce resistance and advising Nagumo that at least one additional strike was necessary to give the amphibious landing force a chance of success. The initial raid had damaged some facilities, but failed to neutralize Midway's airfield, which continued to launch aircraft, including B-17 flying fortresses, against the Japanese fleet itself. And those are slightly more difficult to take down, even though, again, it's a bit risky to fly above. Again, naval AA guns are also pretty intense, really. But, those flying bombs from flying fortresses are really not fine. And here we're talking, again, planes that normally operate at multiple tens of thousands of feet of altitude. 4 engines, again, the Mule really, at least 1943, then there are the B-24s, and the bomb was launched on Japan by B-29s. In any case, you get the gist of that. It's a powerful strategic bombing, at least aircraft. And the Japanese commander promptly ordered the aircraft on his ships to be equipped with ground attack bombs for another raid. Besides, consider this, that you don't, as like with the perfect, say, the accurately calibrated forces for specific attacks on mostly other ships, but also on in this case, mostly just on land target. You don't just take off and simply fly all the way up to chase the B-17. Like, you can at least disperse so many aerial forces in the moment, right? And you have to be ready as a whole force to react to specific threats that have been planned to in this particular operation, right? So everything creates further complication, and it creates chaos among the Japanese, gradually eroding by attrition the entire mission. In fact, this was already some sort of upsetting news, a new message disrupted further Japanese plans. A scout plane delayed in its departure, by the way, due to a catapult malfunction on the cruiser Tone, which can always happen. By the way, everything can go wrong. And again, this guy had the mission of scouting, and he was delayed by this. And at that level, delay means that you will see, things later. And for, ships to have gone pretty further, etc. So it's a very interesting set of circumstances that they're not random, right? They stem from the broader quality of these forces, as banal such accidents could and would be. And the scout plan had finally sighted a substantial enemy fleet to the east, forcing Nagumo to choose between two targets and decide how to address them. Opting to follow doctrine, he chose not to launch an immediate attack on the enemy fleet. Instead, waiting for the return of the airborne aircraft that had been off bombing Midway and ordering the others to switch their payloads to naval bombs, so to eventually cope with the incoming American fleet. This rearming process, which required moving aircraft to and from hangar decks and swapping bombs for torpedoes, by the way, was time-consuming and left the carriers vulnerable, as planes, fuel, and ordnance cluttered the decks, creating a highly combustible environment, by the way. So, as we were saying before, even just a small change is going to engulf a bit of resources here, man of material. This choice would later be judged erroneous, but even a different decision would likely have yielded the same result at that point. American planes were already en route, poised for a massive assault. On June the 4th, the first day of the battle, the Kido Butai's aircraft returning from the Midway raid were caught defenseless on deck during refueling and were incinerated alongside those in the hangars in a single catastrophic fire. I will not digress on the technicalities of aerial warfare. This is a very interesting one, by the way, and I can absolutely tell that this kind of theater is by far the most frightening of all, all right? For so many reasons. If anything, because if you fall into the water, in any case, if you bail out, etc., you are at sea, right? There are just some fixed points that are the carriers. Everything on these is sort of compressed, claustrophobically speaking. The type of planes for Pacific warfare are also substantially different from, say, the one of the Battle of Europe, right? Preferentially, these have stellar engines, because if you take one piston, the whole engine tree does not collapse, right? So you may think it crazy, I don't know, when from Britain they went bombing Germany, coming back of the channel in between. But even if you operated closer to your carrier, it's a freaking carrier, right? You can at most, land in Belgium, in France. You can't get captured. It's not a pleasant experience. But falling at sea, it's something terrifying, right? And consider that here you have to orient yourself just in a very empirical fashion. Besides, again, what is really striking of these Pacific combats you've seen in a lot of World War II footage, video footage, is the intensity, again, of AA guns fire that really makes it very difficult to approach any ship to begin with and to get out there alive. In fact, sort of all the also kamikaze attacks attempt at some point remain attempts, because that's, first of all, a pretty silly decision to begin with. If you are reduced to that to try to win the war, it means you have already lost really badly. But aside from the casualties, in the case they managed to hit the American ships in general, and the Americans did something similar, by the way, in certain circumstances, at least where everything was lost individually, depending on the cases. However, it's really a nightmarish scenario, right? If anything, you can make strike, like in this case, the Americans succeeded in doing, if you find the enemy, you catch the enemy by surprise, in this moment in which they are really switching gears, ammo, they're refueling, and they are obviously like all on this pretty compressed deck, so that if you deliver a bomb just in the middle of that, you're going to destroy, I don't know, 4 or 5, even just without considering further fire, etc., in the explosion itself in the moment. That will spread, of course, with the fuel and fire, etc., but you can easily take out an entire deck, which is exactly what happened in this case. And by the way, the carriers themselves were destroyed, and more critically, their seasoned pilots perished. Right? You really need very darn good men to fly these things, as we were saying before. I mean, just in a psychophysical sense, they must have the strict competence and experience. And training can be quite deadly, right? And it's much more difficult to land on a carrier, by the way, than on a runway on land. You can also land on you can bail out again as well, but you can land on, I don't know, a field of some sort. There, if you miss the deck here, it's a problem for everybody involved, and you can easily damage the plane in many ways, etc. And again, there is a lot of very interesting video footage about this too that illustrates the devastating mistakes. Even it's just not a matter of having had, I don't know, your plane previously damaged, which is also like, yet again, at that point you're trying just to keep it at the same altitude within the right trajectory with wind, the sea moving, the ship moving. If you get hit and you can't keep yourself in the air and sort of by remaining there, if the engine supports you, like being relatively safe. But when you have to land, oh boy, that's really insane. Now, 3 squadrons of American Dauntless A-24 Banshee dive bombers. And again, here there is no teleguided anything. You have to literally aim at what you're bombing. You have to, in fact, dive bombing to ensure that more or less the plane's trajectory sets the right one with gravity for the bomb to fall exactly where you want. And it's already very risky because coming that close to realistically hope to hit a ship is already within the range of its pretty intense AA gunfire. So the attacks were very much en masse. The Americans understood that this was the case to score greater results, but this means that it was just really playing a Russian roulette and seeing pretty terrifying things in the process. And these planes are also less wieldy. All right, the Zeros were actually pretty good. Never really liked the American Pacific planes, aside from other, I don't know, there is the Seafire. That is, in fact, a bit of a different type of plane, but the Americans had from their side firepower and fuel, like a lot of industrial potential. It's like on the Battle of Europe, you see the P-47s, the P-51s. They're, especially the latter is a cool plane, but some are just big, bulky things, right? They're not so sophisticated like, I don't know, the Messerschmitts or even the Focke-Wulf that I liked, frankly, a bit less than the actual Messerschmitt. My favorite plane ever in the world, the best plane, in my opinion, ever made in the moment was the Messerschmitt Bf 109E4 of 1941. In the Pacific, aside from some British planes, I really preferred the Zeros, even though, especially in terms of power, they were never quite the best. But in terms of agility, man, those were very fine pieces of. Oh, and again, I don't know. The Americans had, I don't know, the P-40s. Those are also good planes for the times. These are of the early, more or less, effective. These early, were in 1942 here. Things were already upgrading a little bit, and specifically again for Pacific fighting, which is exactly the point. It's not like there was any other precise reason, but being more functional to that theater, mostly for logistical reasons. I understand we're so crushing. That's why these planes were sort of weird. And that's also how the Americans had the upper end, by the way, because the Japanese did not develop particularly advanced aircraft starting after these years that could quite compete with a broader asset of this broader, again, every type of plane is it like a single instrument in a broader concerto, right? So you must understand it in that broader doctrinal fashion, right? So these A-24 Bashi's were launched from the carrier's Enterprise Hornet in Yorktown. They arrived nearly simultaneously, perfectly positioned in timing, location, and altitude for a devastating 6-minute assault. Basically, everything about Midway is about how superior the Americans really were. Seriously, they were good at everything they did compared to the Japanese. The precise coordination of this attack in particular was facilitated by the efforts of Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, a Naval Academy graduate, an experienced aviator who led the Enterprise's dive bombers and made critical navigational decisions throughout all this to locate the Japanese fleet after initial miscalculation of their positioning. And if there are clouds in between, you don't really see blip. And so at some point you also have to be really lucky, and it's just like a big blue freaking thing where you have to be able to spot at a distance ships, planes, etc. all by eye, naked eye. Most Japanese defensive fighters were engaged against an earlier U.S. torpedo plane attack, by the way, far from their now exposed carriers. So why would you chase that with such large forces? Japanese attack aircraft crowded the hangar decks, still with fuel hoses waving among the refueling crew's legs. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked everywhere, primed to detonate and magnify the damage inflicted by the Americans. The tightly packed ordnance and fuel lines turned minor hits into catastrophic explosions, dooming the carriers Akagi, which I remember now it's pronounced Softway, Kaga, and Soryu within minutes. Right, with Hiryu, we will also, I should have made a battle order at the beginning, but we will see at the end of the day, mostly also with the body count, so to say, the entirety of these forces, with pretty big fleets, right? With the Hiryu following later that day after a desperate counterattack. 4 carriers lost, sunk compared to just one American carrier, the Yorktown, which the Japanese believed they had already incapacitated. But American sailors had repaired it after the initial attack, creating the illusion of sinking 2 carriers instead of 1. So the Yorktown's rapid repair, completed in just 48 hours at Pearl Harbor's dry dock under the supervision of Rear Admiral William L. Calhoun, a logistics expert who oversaw Pearl Harbor's repair facilities, was a testament, also in that case, to American industrial efficiency and determination, allowing it to rejoin the battle despite earlier damage. The Japanese had crossed that out, and they found it back at Midway. The decisive battle Yamamoto had envisioned and pursued concluded in a manner far removed from his expectations. Deprived of most of its air forces, the surviving Japanese fleet launched a few ineffective counterattacks before retreating to Japan in defeat. The loss of over 100 experienced pilots, many of whom were irreplaceable due to Japan's limited training capacity, which could produce only a fraction of the pilots needed annually, severely hampered future operations, forcing the Navy to rely on less skilled replacements who lacked the combat experience of their predecessors. So naval battles can also really end this way. We will resume this a little bit. First of all, battle order. American forces, 3 carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 233 carrier-based aircraft, which is actually a lot, 127 Midway-based aircraft, which is also a lot, 16 submarines. One of these forces, in total, we've seen the Yorktown carrier is sunk. 150 aircraft is destroyed. So the Americans took their share of losses, and this, again, it's a pretty graphic scale of the destruction of at the hand of mostly other planes and AA guns, for a total of 307 men killed, plus other casualties, of course, and 1 destroyer sunk. The Japanese forces had 4 carriers, and all of them are sunk, as we've seen: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. They had 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, 248 carrier-based aircraft. It's interesting also from a numerical point of view that in this sense, the Americans deployed a hell of an aerial power to counter, in fact, as we've seen successfully, the Japanese that had entrusted this 250 aircraft to different operations compared to the ones that they would have had to go to carry out now when the Americans showed up. 2 battleships, 16 seaplanes, and so besides the 4 carriers sunk, all 248 aircraft was destroyed. All of them. This is immense. This is big, all right? But especially the 4 carriers. Over 3,000 men killed, which is paradoxically, aside from especially the pilots, not quite an enormous loss per se, but still reflecting the magnitude of the defeat. 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, and 37 prisoners taken as well, right? So there are interesting, of course, as I was saying at the beginning, this video is an overview, so we're not entering the very depths of Midway, but we can reflect on some aspects with slight further detail. For example, the fact that sometimes tactical missteps can yield benefits, and the heterogenesis of the ends, it happens, especially the bigger the system really is, and you can't see it all the time in warfare. If anything, it's by the laws of reciprocity, not just between the enemy, but also considering the continuum within your forces themselves. The initial American air attack on the Japanese carriers that was conducted between 9:20 and 10 a.m. on June the 4th by 41 American torpedo planes ended in total failure. All right. Dispatched hurriedly without sufficient escort, 35 planes were shot down. And it's pretty graphic when you see it, because these are attacking all, as we've seen, en masse. And worse, arguably, none of their torpedoes actually struck their targets. All Mark 13 torpedoes, new and untested in combat, in fact, either missed, sank, or hit enemy hulls without detonating. This is insane because, again, had they at least functioned, there would have been at least some kind of further loss. But it's not all. The Mark 13's flaws, including faulty magnetic detonators and unreliable depth settings, were later identified as having with systemic issues that plagued U.S. torpedo attacks early in the war altogether. Because naturally, you can't fully see what's happening. It's not like today somebody's taking a video with their phone to properly allow for lots of material to study the effect of this stuff. And even today, it's sort of selectively difficult, at least for the general public. But this would go as far as requiring extensive redesign by the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. Yet, the sacrifice of the U.S. crews was not futile. First, the Japanese carriers were forced into evasive maneuvers to avoid at least some of these torpedoes to arrive and to hit, delaying the preparation of their aircraft for a counterattack in the process. Second, the Japanese defensive fighters moved away from the carriers and were low on ammo and fuel in the battle's critical juncture that I had carefully planned, overly planned to an extent. Because this was such a large force that the extent by which Yamamoto had tried to think every single detail of their interaction was a bit overstretched. Too much overconfidence in, again, a sort of rigid, okay, I say this will happen because everybody will obey down the line. That's actually how it turns out. Things do not really work, especially when things start going wrong, and they always go wrong at some point during the operation. The torpedo planes, led by squadrons like VT-8 under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a Naval Academy graduate with a reputation for tenacity who insisted on attacking despite overwhelming odds, drew off the Japanese Zero fighters, leaving the Harriers unprotected just as the dive bombers arrived, creating a critical window for the main destructive attack that turned the tide of the battle, as we just described. Waldron's squadron was almost entirely wiped out, but their sacrifice disrupted Japanese operations at a pivotal moment. What else can we say about the Battle of Midway? It's again, in these overviews, it's not much the depth of the analysis that, again, can seem, again, especially in the moment of these attacks, something, right? Naturally, things are slightly more complex than the few times at our disposal will allow to describe. That's, again, why I will make more in-depth videos on this, because there were so many other different crucial passages that, as minors, they may seem actually brought to the result that we know. Speaking of Doolittle's Raid, when the US bombed Japan, and in showing all the difficulties that even a relatively small mission entailed for the people who participated in it, and how much it would morally, its outcome would morally escalate by essentially showing Japan that there was no return from what they had unleashed in Pearl Harbor. The United States aviation industry had recently developed the NA-40. There was a long-range aircraft with modifications became what we better know as B-25 bomber. Although its range was significantly improved compared to other models, further enhancements were required to enable the 16 aircraft stowable on the Hornet to reach Japan. B-25 is a great bomber because, again, it's fairly small. To some extent, it works like some sort of fighter bomber, right? It has it's well protected, but it's agile, right? It can perform interesting maneuvers. It cannot simply dogfight unless we're talking. In fact, other bombers of some sort of Japanese had something similar to that as well. And if anything, that is important when you look at all these, low, like in Doolittle's Raid, like this low altitude bombings. If you think about the Pacific Islands in general, right, going up and down, like targeting ships, for example, that have very strong AA guns. You want to maintain a low profile, flying low on water, then rising up, going across above the island, then bombing, and then turning immediately away. These are very good. These are things you can't do with B-17s, all right? You can't do it, but you will much more easily be taken down at that point. B-25 is really great at those maneuvers. There would be other, think about the P-38 later, which is not, it's more like, it's a very unique design, as you know, but it's much more agile and loaded, especially with rockets, which Americans, for their specific strategic and logistical goals, had to use quite often. There are some similar solutions in other theaters, but again, the Pacific is really unique at a point. Now, although the B-25 range was significantly improved compared to other models, further enhancements were required to enable the aforementioned 16 aircraft stowable on the Hornet to reach Japan. It's insane if you think about that, and because it's a single carrier, right? So you have a minimal space on the runway. These modifications included removing excess weight as a consequence, adding extra fuel tanks, however, and equipping the planes with the ICER boots for high-altitude flight. Even then, the range was insufficient for a return flight, so the planes were to continue westward and land on the mainland, because as we've seen, again, they were spotted before they could just exploit the ship's fuel rather than their own in the air. Now, after the Soviet Union adamantly refused to provide Siberian airfields for this purpose, citing its neutrality pact with Japan, signed in April 1941, by the way, China became the unavoidable choice, despite objections from nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, a military leader who had, as you know, unified much of China in the 1920s, but feared Japanese retaliation would destabilize his fragile coalition. And upon reaching their targets, Doolittle and his crew dropped their payloads, damaging some installations and military factories and killing 50 civilians in them. And an estimated 250,000 Chinese later perished in Japanese reprisals for the Doolittle Raid alone, right? As Japan launched Operation Saigo, it was a brutal campaign targeting Chinese airfields and villages suspected of aiding the raiders, devastating the entire communities in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, which scorched earth tactics. Again, to the Japanese, the Chinese were just some dirty animals. And when we speak of this, you realize how sort of different the ends, the purposes, and also the different national interests end up being behind this big, in this case, small but incredibly consequential, at least, actions that, in that sense, depended also on these various vicissitudes. Finally, could spend some word, given that we started sort of from the Japanese perspective, we can't go a full circle here. There would be a lot to speak about the American side of the story. We'll have to talk about the American strategy in the Pacific War. We'll have to talk about some of the fiercest battles of this theater. Again, Schwerpunkt wants to really go full encyclopedic with the channel. Yamamoto's vision is important to understand because, as you realize, this was the mind behind it all in a broader strategic sense. And this guy had seen literally Tsushima, had seen a world changing, had really come from of course, the most traditional Japanese background, but had witnessed a sort of most modernized American one in person. So there was so much at stake for him, even as a leader, behind the mere military enterprise was as crushingly overwhelming in responsibility terms as it sounds. What we realize here, first of all, is that basically the Japanese postured themselves as, okay, let's launch a massive attack, but let's not essentially organize it in a way that expects any immediate counter measure, right? And that's where also the numerical advantage sought by the admiral proved insufficient. As we've seen, the Americans also did their best to put together, for example, especially more aerial power, but also naval forces were really substantial, even after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto's plan, perhaps overly intricate in spreading ships across too vast an area, was deemed robust by the Japanese. Hastily formulated after Doolittle's raid, it was well organized and ensured significant loyal superiority, but for that specific kind of mission they had envisaged, not for the one that would actually turn out to be. So in the primary battle zone, Japanese estimates, as we've seen, essentially from their side, 4 carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers against 3 American carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The inclusion of the Aleutian diversion intended to split American forces required significant resources as well, including 2 light carriers and their escorts, which could have bolstered the main fort at Midway. All right. The imbalance in forces appeared overwhelming. Only in the number of carriers, available aircraft, and submarines was the approximate parity. Despite various setbacks during execution, it seemed Yamamoto held all the winning cards in principle, and it's plausible that a more effective reconnaissance force for the Kido Butai could have altered the battle's outcome, tipping that, again, that 50%. the reliance on a single delayed scout plane from the cruiser Tone compound by poor weather and mechanical issues meant the Japanese were unaware of the American carrier's positions until it was too late, a failure that left Kido Butai blindsided. And so this is very educational because you have a Japanese superiority. As we've seen, it's not scalar, or at least it is when you especially look at strictly naval forces, strictly meant. Of course, they're attacking a fortified position, an island. There's all the invasion force in between. They don't think they will have to cope with a substantial American force to begin with, nor especially such a powerful aerial one. But if you look at what, at least if anything, the highlights that we discussed today, you realize that basically the Japanese were worse at everything they did here, right? There is not a single thing that the Americans did in a negative way, given the means at hand, right? There is the first attack, again, that is a disaster, but it's at least connected with you cannot compare with the destruction that the Japanese went under when, being caught off guard, like on the deck, that brings to the sinking of the same carriers. It's disproportionate. So basically everything that the Americans did, the Japanese did worse, which means was that evidently, given the initial Japanese superiority, for the Americans to eventually overwhelmingly crush the Japanese fleet and destroying its entire aerial fleet at that point in the battle speaks of an overwhelming American superiority. Yes, we can speak of luck, as we just said. There were things could have really altered the battle course in many ways, but at the same time, it's part of the same course where you can't say just, okay, but because that single thing did not go right, the rest simply wasn't there in terms of quality, or the enemy would have not adapted in certain ways. Of course, the Americans could have lost, all right, and they would have had some of these issues in other circumstances as well. Nothing is perfect, and you always have setbacks in every operation, even the most successful one like this. At the same time, there is something that is being told in this battle, and that speaks of the dramatic American development in practically every field compared to Japan. All right, there is really, even in terms of countries, a radical divide. All right, Japan is not as powerful, affluent, developed as the United States are. All right, so the roles in the world are different. You can see how Japan engulfed itself also in China, that sucked a lot of manpower in, etc. They were that absolutely and ferociously driven, as we've seen. But at the same time, they lacked that greater comprehensive, higher vision that the United States and the West, their allies in general, could afford in a deeper sense. It's a bit like, the Soviet Union. Like, you can't speak of it as if it was like a normal power where things went well, if anything, because, they were so good at it. All right. It was a terrible mess. And war is just always a terrible mess, but it depends on how you still handle it. Right. At Midway, the American definitely established a reputation that is essentially the one that, generally speaking, the American Navy has maintained to this day in its global role, and that was really tested in the fray. All right, and you've seen also how new that they hadn't even tested the torpedoes in combat, etc. So they wouldn't even realize that they were faulty for a while. But this is also the product of American relative isolationism and the fact that the war at this point had not yet fully broken out, at least in this scope of naval, especially for America, that at this point fought essentially in the Japanese, of course, in a broader naval aerial sense. So that dimension had not been tested properly. And then we'll have to see how the entire global theater evolves, because that's the most interesting aspect of it all. It's just seeing how powers reacted to this, right? Even when they were sort of far away from having some kind of broader novel. I mean, look at the Germans. It's not like they could venture in the seas with, with like the Japanese or the Americans could do, right? However, right, still there is an impact that involves pretty much everyone, and that is interesting to look in that broader fashion. And that's, again, what we mostly discuss on Schwerpunkt, which I think is, in some ways, the most interesting thing of this channel, the way we are able to look at so many different things, but remaining coherent in a broader narrative, right? This is not just a standalone story for getting views or likes. This is really, we are thinking here what it means to go to war, and in which circumstances, with which means, naturally, in this, I think this is not even 2 hours of video. You can't probably even begin to imagine what that is practically. But at the same time, it is an exercise that you can make in this also relatively simple level of analysis for an introductory video, or even an overview, given the astonishing result. Like, warfare surprises you in this regard, and not much just how different the outcome can be from predictions, which is impactful enough, but the sheer level of how, when things start going wrong, there is a cascade that is mostly moral in nature. When you lose control, when you are also passively receiving, just sticking to the book, so to say, to the manual, you're basically losing entirely. The Japanese losses at Midway were astonishing. Were something in the broader economy of that war, like the strategic economy, so to say, of the clash, were irreplaceable, and this would stay this way for the rest of the war. So it's more than an important battle, right? And again, we should understand better where the Americans were coming from. That's why, for example, I cited before, for example, the institutions from which these various commanders at different levels of the hierarchy had come from, because it's not a random product, right? There was a debate behind that. It was a policy behind that. It was a control behind that. It was a culture behind that. And you can't understand it if you can't understand, say, I don't know, the video they made on the 4th of July on the American long rifle of the United States War of Independence, or any other topic that also had maybe nothing to do about America. And that also is particularly there when you study, the same, Asian warfare, the Japanese. Where did these guys come from? Why is that they decided to do what they did during, actually before World War II as well? This is deep and important, and it doesn't begin the day before. All right, that's why history is so crucial, and you must really get at the core of it to understand some deeper aspects of your own same culture and world that very, very often we're not willing to admit even to ourselves. Because again, I think one of the most common mistakes I was talking about at the beginning is thinking that this is the world and these are the minds that we know today. Hell no. All right. Aside from the fact that people in general will better in some broader sense, the question of simply looking at the beliefs they had compared to our own, and how much more normal, for example, the same concept of war really was for everybody involved. Even when you see the same resistance, the same sabotage, the same internal sabotage, propaganda, etc. at the time, it really makes you think so much how today is kind of different, but also similar on different tracks. and how you can't unsee it. You can't unsee the struggle within itself, the fact that the result of it all was not something pre-established, like a story that you read and you already know how it ends. No, it was fought through, right? And in most horrifying ways, as a matter of fact. And so creating a world, an insight, a concept that is beyond like the normal thinking you see among people nowadays, just by talking to them, right? It's a problem. People have become ever more weak, deflected, alienating from reality under every aspect. Moral, political, cultural. They literally want to pretend that there is just those two things in their lives and the rest does not count, or at least they are in that way and there is nothing else to know, and things do not change, and things are like that just because they can't emotionally shelter them. History is the complete antidote to this, right? And or at least what you can derive from history as well, because naturally there are lots of people who hijack history for the silliest reasons, but again, we're not there, hopefully, for that. In any case, again, I'm glad we have discussed Midway, because we really, I don't know how many videos we have made. I think let me check. Probably not many. We haven't even made a World War II playlist, which is bizarre because I thought we haven't made enough about World War I, or at least we have really talked a lot about that. And it seems to me, in fact, we have to dramatically expand on World War II because it's possibly made even more about World War II, I think. Yep, something like that. But we still have to create the world of playlist. I think that, we're doing something. I'm really happy that in the last year or so, we really made so many videos about World War II. Because for a couple of years we had done none, really, not even by accident. And then we made tens at this point. Yeah. That's how it should be, right? We can't... And it, we're getting a fair amount of views, by the way. So, again, very good. We shall start integrating, again, with contemporary history, manualistic history, the world glue, because it can't be just warfare. We must really expand this at so many other levels. Nevertheless, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.